The Immersion Foundation presents deep conversation with ambassadors on the cutting edge of combative arts as part of a greater mission to revive the study of hoploology through research, expeditions, and archival projects around the world. The Immersion Foundation combines rigorous academic research with hands-on immersion in the combative arts and elite performance training, forging a new path of growth, adventure, and contribution.
Hi, this is Mahit Paldonia, and welcome to the next edition of our Immersion Talks. Today we have Dr. TJ Obi here with us, and our goal is to start delving into the world of the Afro-Caribbean diaspora and their arts. So, with that, first of all, TJ, welcome, and I appreciate you coming online. Just for everybody out there, if you don't mind, just give us a quick short intro of you and what these Afro diaspora arts in the Americas are.
Yeah, sure. So I am a professor of African and African diaspora history, primarily an ethnographer, and I've spent most of my life researching, studying, training African and African diaspora martial arts. When I started this work, it was at a time period before martial arts studies had been kind of revived as an academic art form. And so I was kind of on my own working out the ethnography and history of African and African diaspora martial arts, and have been doing such ever since.
Yeah, TJ, in his typical fashion, is being very, very understated. He's a very, very serious martial artist and an academic, and who's done this for more years than most of us have even been training or just doing our academics. So, TJ, first of all, thank you. So, TJ, for the uninitiated, those who know nothing about the arts in the Americas, whatnot, what would you say if you could give a 2 or 3 minute quick overview of what these Afro American arts are? What do they look like? Just kind of a 50,000-foot view for the uninitiated, like say you'd speak to your mom or my mom to explain what the hell we do.
Yeah, sure. So there's a range in terms of physical practices. There are a range of different types of martial arts that we find throughout the African diaspora. We have, in terms of unarmed arts, we have headbutting, foot fighting, kicking. We have sweeping, specifically sweeping and takedown things, but with legs primarily. And then there's different forms of grappling, and then there are combinations of these, and then there are weapon arts, and probably the most widespread of the weapon arts are the art of fighting with the azagaya, or the African spear, and the machete and sticks. But also there are secondary ones such as rock throwing, etc. So there's a really wide range of physical practices surrounding the martial arts in the African diaspora. Pretty much anywhere in the African diaspora you go, there were different martial arts during the time of slavery. Now, one thing I should be clear about: we can talk about multiple different African diasporas. So in the case of the African diaspora into the Indian Ocean, this is a very unique in the sense that many of the Africans who were taken into places such as India were taken as mercenaries, as soldiers, basically. And so it is not surprising at all in that case that you would find that these Africans went with their martial arts. Also, we also have to separate out the African diaspora through the Islamic slave trade. And this was much earlier than the Atlantic slave trade. And in Islam, again, Africans were associated with different very particular martial arts styles, which they, very different from what we think of in the Atlantic, uh, uh, diaspora. Um, we have some really striking examples of where slaves use their martial arts for the defense of their masters. And they were recognized as masters, particularly over the staff and the spear. But what I'm going to be speaking about today is the Atlantic slave trade, which is later than the slave trade in the Islamic world and the slave trade to the East. So this is much later. But we just have to put this in the larger context that the earlier and in some ways the longer lasting of the slave trades were actually to Asia. So this later slave trade, which was conducted by Europeans, was distinct in a number of ways, both in terms of the approach to slavery, because the way that slavery played out both in India and in the Islamic world was quite distinct from the chattel slavery imposed by Europeans. So let's just have that. And so there's distinguishing marks in both the history of the martial arts in these different slave trades, but also the response to them because of the nature of the oppressive nature of the slave trade in the Atlantic world. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll just be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no,
Sorry.
that was great.
It's important to give context
No,
because a lot of Americans don't even realize that the earlier and the longer slave trades were actually to Asia, not to the United States or Brazil or whatever. So it's important.
Correct.
It's
And I
important
think
to say
also,
a lot about those other things, but there's not time, and it would require a lot of backstory to educate typical Americans about those. So
yeah, I think we should approach that at some other point. Just if I may add a little bit of color to the Asia piece, because it's a piece that I've researched quite a bit as well. The Africans that came, especially into India, in two regions were completely integrated. And there are entire villages, and they're treated quite normally. But anyway, that's a different topic. So, like you said, TJ, in the Atlantic and the Americas. Now, again, for the normie who may still not understand or want further context, what countries are we talking about when we say the African diaspora in the Atlantics?
Yeah, so we're talking all the way from the southern tip of South America all the way into Canada. So in this entire range from South, Central, and Northern America, haven't found any documentation in Alaska, but as far as north as Canada, certainly there were Africans and African and their descendants using specifically African diaspora martial arts.
So, bringing us to one of the main things that I was hoping for us to dwell into, one defining characteristic of this particular group is this concept or idea of Malicia. So, TJ, I was hoping that I've shut up now and you jump in on what Malicia is and how it manifests and its importance within the martial traditions of the Afro-American diaspora. So, over to you, TJ.
Certainly, yeah. So the concept of Malicia is really a central concept, and I describe it as a grand strategy, and I'll come back to that in a second. But initially, prior to the Atlantic slave trade, Malicia was a philosophy of power subversion. And this is an approach to dealing with asymmetrical power relationships in Africa. And so long before the slave trade, we had the development of, and completely unrelated to slavery in any sense, we had the rise of what were known as, by scholars, as trickster heroes in Africa. And these trickster heroes were, um, now, in some cases, they were deified. Some cases, they were just, folk heroes, etc. Sometimes they were central to the religion. So that changed from location to location. But what we can say as a whole about the trickster hero is that they rose up, and they embodied a philosophy to how to deal with despotism and disproportionate power relations. And so these trickster heroes, there were a number of them, but there are three largest when we look across West Africa. We had the spider, referred to as Anansi. We had, and this is primarily in Western Africa, around the Volta River region, the area that is referred to by Europeans as the Gold Coast, where most of the gold mining in Western Africa was located. And in this region, the most prominent of the trickster heroes was Anansi the spider. And we had in the Bight of Biafra, all the way in the corner of Western Africa, we had the tortoise. And there the tortoise was the primary trickster hero. But overall, and then also in the two ends, both in the furthest part of Western Africa and throughout Central Africa, the primary trickster figure was the hare, or what we call in America the rabbit. And these figures rose up, and in times when a political despot would arise, people would kind of emulate these trickster heroes to topple this type of tyrannical centralized power. So it was often associated with that, although it's these figures circulated even when there was, even when the political system was beneficial for all, and it wasn't a despot. These figures came up, but they were very, very much important and called upon and used in these times of power discrepancies and despotism. Now, enter the Atlantic slave trade. People from all these regions of West Africa were taken to places like Brazil, North America, the Caribbean, and these enslaved Africans found themselves in a state of oppression, particularly because of the nature of American chattel slavery, in which enslaved Africans were treated as, in many ways, objects. And this caused a huge power discrepancy between the enslaved Africans and the master class, European enslavers. And so this philosophy took on the characteristics of a grand strategy. So when we talk about military, in terms of the military arts, we have at the top, we have a grand strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? Which is in some ways more important than what are your, what tactics are you using? What are your underlying techniques and all of this stuff? Grand strategies. What are you trying to accomplish? And what are your main goals of how are you going to accomplish this? So much higher than tactics and much higher than than techniques and technologies. And so the grand strategy on the part of enslaved Africans throughout the Americas was to follow the pattern of these trickster heroes and employ malicia or cunning. Now, throughout the Americas, if you go through Brazil, Colombia, North America, all of the Caribbean islands, they continue to pass on these tales of the trickster heroes. Whether you go to anywhere in the Caribbean, Colombia, Brazil, you will hear the word Anansi, who is sorry, let me silence my phone, I apologize. The trickster, the spider trickster hero. In North America, most Americans, because of Uncle Tom's Cabin, know the story of Brer Rabbit. But these were stories that were circulated within the slave population, kind of teaching them the strategies and the tactics of how to overcome a more powerful opponent. And this is what Malicia is, this strategy of how to do it. Now, when we break down Malicia, particularly when we come to the level of martial arts. So many of the martial arts in the Americas are just physical embodiments and tools to pass down to younger generations Malicia training. So, for example, in the case of Brazil, with capoeira, you could have the most amazing physical techniques. You could do triple backflips and all sorts of have the highest kicks and the fastest kicks. If you don't have Malicia, the master will say you have nothing. Capoeira is nothing. The jogo de capoeira is nothing if not an educational pedagogy for teaching corporal Malicia. The same with Grima, the machete and spear-based martial arts of Colombia. The masters often say, "Sin malicia no hay nada." There's nothing without Malicia, and it doesn't matter if the masters, they're not as fast as they were when they were younger. They're, but they have the Malicia, and they will always overcome not because of superior technique or whatever, but because of superior Malicia. And so without Malicia, there's nothing in these martial arts. And so we have to understand these martial arts are ultimately vehicles to pass down Malicia. And so now breaking it down in terms of these martial arts, we can then further break down Malicia into 3 subdivisions. One is called cautela, which is sometimes transcribed as circumspection, but this is about observation and orientation, reading your opponent and reading the situation, and understanding the traps that would befall you if you were to take physical action. And then on the other side, we have astucia, which is guile, craftiness. This is the ability to create and take advantage of openings left by your opponent. And then third, we have mañas or tricks, which are kind of like applied cautela and applied astucia, but with a focus primarily on tricking. Now, when it comes to cautela, this awareness, this plays out when you are attacking, but primarily it's a defensive ability to be able to read the dangers that you could be put in by your opponent. And this is central In the at least in the martial arts of Grima in Colombia, a common phrase is el ojo que juega. It's the eye that plays, because it is your ability to read potential dangers, which is the central skill of a grimista, of a practitioner of this art. And so we can look at this awareness both on a larger, a macro and a micro scale. So on the macro scale, understanding, particularly in the time of slavery, that the enslaved understood that they were in a power discrepancy, and so they knew they couldn't act directly, and so they had to use indirect action. And so the tales, the trickster tales, often talk about what happens, how you can. They are a positive ideal in how to overcome people with Malicia, but they are sometimes also a negative idea of what happens if you don't use astucia. And the characteristic, or kind of a widespread tale in this case, is the story of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. Most people might know this from the Disney rendition, if nothing else. So the enemies of Brer Rabbit, Brer Bear, and Bear Fox, they create a tar baby. They create a false person, a mannequin made out of tar. And Brer Rabbit comes by and greets the tar baby, and the tar baby doesn't respond, which is in African culture, strong emphasis on greeting and degreeting practices. And so anyway, Brer Rabbit gets mad and strikes the tar baby without thinking, without astucia. And what happens? He gets stuck. And he gets mad again and strikes the tar baby with his other hand or paw, and gets stuck. And then he kicks, and so he's completely stuck to this tar baby. And then out come Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and he's caught. And this is an important kind of negative lesson for enslaved Africans, how they cannot allow their emotions to get the best of them. They can't strike out in anger, because they're in a situation where they're fighting against greater powers. And if you are enslaved African and you strike a white person who insults you, you will be killed for it. And so this is also kind of where the concept of playing the dozens, later, the name playing the dozens and its formulation is much later, was much later in the 19th century. But this concept of having to master your emotions, and so what this is, for those who are not familiar, this is where the playing the dozens, as it would come to us in the later 19th century, is African Americans would take turns insulting each other, talking about their mothers with in insinuating context, because this is one of the things. If you can control yourself from responding when someone insults your mother, you should be able to control yourself in any context. And this was important to keep you alive, not only during slavery, but even in the antebellum and post-slavery periods, when with things like the Ku Klux Klan, etc., where power dynamics still made it impossible to fully play out your emotions the way you wanted to when you were in the context of a white context, or in the context of the master class. And so these things worked out themselves this way on the macro scale. On the micro scale, this was really about you had to learn to read your opponent. And so in the case of capoeira, you always had to have an escape plan, because you would never just go in 100% with a technique without astucia, because there might be a trap waiting for you. So you can't take advantage of even overt seeming easy target is probably too good to be true. And so if you're going to take it, you have to take it with an escape plan in mind, because it's probably a trap. So conversely, on the other side, with astucia and creating openings, this was something that on the macro scale, on the philosophical level, enslaved Africans knew that they had to win by being tricky. And in fact, in North America, one of the longest um, um, African phrases that was retained in African American culture was a Central African proverb that says, he's tricky, I'll win by being tricky too. And it's from Central Africa. And this Bantu phrase was passed on in African Americans in the Carolinas when most of the rest of African language was gone. And then it's telling. And so with astucia, the idea of creating openings with craftiness, this on the macro scale, this played out in terms of dissimulation. And so offensively, people realize that it would be foolish to respond in a place where you have no power and your opponent has no opening. And so you would have to learn to swallow your pride and be patient. So a big part of this Malicia training is humility, because it is really about, okay, be humble and wait, be patient. So I'll give you an example. When I first went to Brazil in the 1990s and I trained with the oldest master I trained with was João Pequeno. He was a master of masters when it comes to Capoeira Angola. And when he was much younger, he was playing another master, and that master gave him a rasteira, a foot sweep, in a public presentation where they were performing, kind of for, in a public setting, and it was more like a performative setting. And this other master swept him in this place, and he lost face. Well, Mr. João Pequeno waited decades. They were now both old men, and they were again playing in a public thing, and Master João Pequeno feigned, a playful game, and when the other guy responded with a playful game, he entered and bloodied the guy's nose, and the guy was looking at him like, what are you doing? And he went up to whisper to him, do you remember 15 years ago that rasteira and that's Malicia, waiting. And if you have to wait a decade, 2 decades till your opponent has an opening, then you wait. So that's astucia on the macro level. On the micro level, it's about dissimulation. So, for example, in the martial art of Grima, we have footwork patterns called falsos. And so a master who's fighting and he doesn't see an opening in his opponent, he might pretend to be doing defensive falsos back and forth, but what he's actually doing is every time he's coming across, he's dragging his foot with his falso to pile up dirt, so that at the opportune moment he can grab that pile of dirt, throw it in opponent's face to create a momentary opening so he can strike. So again, but doing it in a way where it looks like he's just using defensive footwork to hide the fact that he's actually creating this opening. And then the third component is manias, or tricks, technology. And this can be micro dissimulation, feigning one attack so that you can attack someplace else. It can be pretending to be that the game is done, offering your hand, and when the guy goes to shake your head, you give him a headbutt, as so often in capoeira. These types of tricks, manias are tricks, which usually require dissimulation. These also are central to Malicia, and this is also where Malicia overlaps with spiritual practices, because tricks in the African American context, what we call about use the term tricking is the earlier term, or the later term tricknology. In either case, these terms were synonymous with conjure, root doctoring, with practical spirituality, I call it. The spiritual practice is to overcome a rival on the spiritual plane. And so in the time of slavery, the African American martial art of knocking and kicking was practiced in the context of what's called the old time religion, which was infused with this. So it is in a religious context. It comes out of a religious context, and it cannot be separated from the concept of spiritual tricking or spiritual conjure or spiritual manipulation in order to gain an advantage. Because while enslaved Africans and their descendants on the political and the military plane were at a disadvantage, they could also try and create advantages by working on the spiritual plane. And that was in African American parlance. That's why both tricking and tricknology were used both. This is applied Malicia on the physical and spiritual planes. Okay, so I think that's an overarching overview of Malicia for today.
One natural question that comes from this is, it's so deeply rooted in culture, and you have to understand where you come from, and then okay, it makes sense. But what about say some random Indian dude who wants to now start doing this, or another lost American who's like, hey, these arts look beautiful, these arts look deadly, but how does one then begin to learn Malicia? Because like you said, without Malicia, these arts don't exist.
Yeah. Well, and part of it is just to understand to understand the why behind everything. So, for example, to really, I mean, when an American, someone's first starting capoeira, for example, they learn the jinga, and it's often portrayed just for simplicity of teaching large numbers of people. It's often done in this kind of cookie cutter, formulaic way. But as you come to understand what jinga is, you understand that it's not supposed to be formulaic and predictable. As with time, you're supposed to personalize it so that your jinga becomes your jinga, and so that you can hide your defense and offense in dynamic motion. And that understanding the whys, because that should be a big why. Why, in so many Asian martial arts, or the Asian martial arts that are popular in the United States, stance is everything. You watch a Chinese kung fu movie, it starts with stance training and all this stuff. And so why don't Africans fight like that? Well, again, because of this philosophy. We're not trying. If we assume that our opponents are stronger than us, we can't use power. In these contexts, we have to use dissimulation, hiding our attacks and our defenses. When it comes to Grima, the African martial art of Colombia, or martial arts, since there are many of them, again, the foundational movements are called cruzas. They're educational choreographies, but what are they? They are first and ABCs into the techniques, yes, but then they always become an opening into learning Malicia. And so they always start out choreographed, but then we add improvisation. And improvisation, and this is the key, as you learn, when you improvise, that's your Malicia. You're learning when to improvise. In some arts, the improvisation is on the side of the attacker. Some arts, the improvisation is on the side of the defender. But in all cases, it's you have to apply your Malicia to know when you should improvise. And then the choreography disappears altogether, and then we come to what's called the Ronda de Malicia. Um, and the Ronda is also in the same thing. So this is literally the term for this is the circle of Malicia. And this is when we let go all choreography and now we're improvising, and the improvisation has to become personalized. You have to learn to read your opponent, beware of his traps, particularly in a game like later forms of Grima, where they use these defensive positions called paradas to make it look like they're open because they want you to attack a certain way because they have a prepared attack. So you have to learn to rondar, which is to be able to circle and read the true openings from the false openings, and enter with Malicia. And another one of these terms that we find throughout the Americas, whether we go to Brazil, Colombia, throughout the Caribbean, we find this term nyangasa, or variations of it throughout the Caribbean. And nyangasa means to enter, enter to test. So you enter, but you don't really enter. You fake an attack, but it's not an attack. You're just reading your opponent's defense to see how they respond, and then when you detect the pattern, then you're going to attack based on how they react to that attack. And so in both Grima and Capoeira, which is probably the most well-known of the African diaspora martial arts, it's all about the game of playing, of reading these attacks, these defenses, fake attacks, fake openings, and it comes. You learn it. If you're playing with a master, you're going to learn all this Malicia because it's so part and parcel of the educational paradigm, that that you'll, if you're open, you will learn it.
No, I think
So
that's a great context, TJ. I think if I may suggest that for our second talk next week, if we can get into the pedagogy of teaching and learning this Malicia and some of the bigger buckets of tactics in this way of deception that you've found and uncovered, that hey, these are the pieces. It'll be a really good framework for the uninitiated and also other researchers as they go in to say, okay, this is what it is, this is what has been found, and now I can say, okay, this is where I need to go. So I just want to make sure I understand it right? So Malicia, it's a way of balancing a power dynamic where you are at a disadvantage, and now how do I use this disadvantage to change the game? And if that means me waiting 15 years, I will do so. If it means me sweeping the floors for me to gain entrance in, I do so. And then when that moment comes, I have the coup de grace, and it's all over.
Exactly. That's it. Exactly. Yes.
All right. So with that, we'll stop today's episode, TJ. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our next piece where we get into the pedagogy of both the teaching and what helps students learn this Malicia and the big buckets.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Mahipam.